Probably my all-time favorite television series was The West Wing. The saga of Josiah Bartlett and his band of aides and supporters. As a longtime history buff, especially presidential history, I've watched every episode of this series at least twice, if not more often, to the chagrin of my wife. One of President Bartlett's favorite sayings was, "What's next?" In one of the earliest episodes, Josh Lyman, the Deputy Chief of Staff, played by Madison's own Brand Whitford, is making an argument to the then candidate Bartlett over some matter of policy or electoral tactics. At some point in the discussion, Bartlett barks, "What's next?" Lyman tries to continue the discussion, but Bartlett cuts him off, pointing out that when he says, "What's next?" it means that he, Bartlett, has made the decision, is ready to move on to a different topic. Now, this question is uniquely human. One of the traits that distinguishes human beings from other creatures is that we are conscious of the fact that we will die. At some point in our development, we learn that life is finite, that there will come a time when we will no longer be physically present on this earth, and as we get older, this fact becomes more and more real. We realize that we are closer to the end than the beginning. And yet it has been suggested that our understanding of our mortality is what adds to the richness of our lives. Because our days are finite, they are also precious. At some point in the history of human development, we began to try to come to terms with the question of death. Was death really the end, or was there something more? Was there another world beyond this one? Eventually, early humans began to do more than simply abandon the bodies of their dead compatriots. Archaeology has discovered signs, even among the ancient Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals, of rituals surrounding the event of death. People began to mark the site of graves and leave mementos to the dead. These rituals are in fact the precursors of what would become religion in later times. As civilizations became more complex, the rituals surrounding death and dying became more involved as well, especially for the rich who had the wherewithal to expend parts of their wealth to celebrate their deaths and prepare an easy path to the next world. The pyramids of ancient Egypt serve as a reminder of the importance of the journey to the afterlife in that culture. Many other ancient cultures had their own death and burial rituals. Early views of the afterlife were generally negative and had little to do with your behavior during your lifetime. Sheol or Hades, the Hebrew and Greek names for the underworlds, while not seen as places of torment, were also not places of pleasure. Thus, neither the promise of paradise nor the threat of punishment was used to control moral behavior in those cultures. However, beginning around 1400 BCE, Mesopotamian and Indian cultures began to equate one's fate in the world beyond death with one's conduct in this world. Admirable behavior was rewarded, while evil acts were punished. However, in general, prior to the first millennium BCE, attitudes toward the afterlife were not positive. This began to change in the Axial Age between about 800 to 200 BCE. The time of Socrates, the Buddha, and the writers of the Hebrew Scriptures and others. It is during this era that the notion of what we now call a soul, separate from the body, emerges. The soul is seen as something which will survive the physical death and live on, either in paradise or in some instances a place of punishment, though not necessarily eternal punishment. While initially the soul was disembodied, in some cultures, including some schools of Judaism, the notion of a physical resurrection where the body and soul are reunited appeared. Zoroastrianism, the religion of ancient Persia, now Iran, developed a theology of eternal bliss for those who worship the one true God and punishment for the wicked, at least until God conquers evil, at which time all are redeemed. These threads eventually worked themselves into the views of Christianity and Islam as they contemplated the afterlife. Meanwhile, in the East, among the Hindus and later the Buddhists, concepts of reincarnation or samsara developed. Rather than seeing a lineal path from this life to the next, with reward or punishment dependent on your behavior in this life, Hinduism and Buddhism are cyclical. They posit a cycle of birth, life, death, rebirth, life, death, that goes on until, in the Buddhist terminology, one achieves enlightenment, where the cycle of death and rebirth finally end in nirvana. Thus, reincarnation is not seen as something good, but rather a treadmill that one wishes to exit as soon as possible. What all of these ideas have in common is that this life is only one part of a much larger scheme, a way station to something different and hopefully better. While they provide a mechanism of social control, a way to encourage proper behavior in this life to avoid an unpleasant fate in the next. Among the Abrahamic monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, ideas of the afterlife have taken on various levels of importance. Of the three, notions of the afterlife are the least important to Judaism. Built on the covenant between God and the chosen people, Judaism focused on behavior in this life as a reflection of the relation of the Jewish people to their God. While some of the doctrines of an afterlife, including early notions of bodily resurrection, developed during the time of Jesus and were known to his followers, this has never been the central point of Judaism. Orthodox Christianity, and by that I mean standard Christianity, not necessarily Eastern Orthodox, has a belief in life after death with a physical resurrection at the end of time. To varying degrees, there is a belief in heaven as a reward for those who believe and accept the grace of God, and eternal punishment for those who do not accept God's gift. Most Christian theology proposes that Jesus' death and resurrection provides a path to eternal life for believing Christians. While these broad belief statements are many and varied, they are interpreted differently by various Christian sects. Within Islam, the ultimate destination is determined on the Day of Judgment. On that last day, Allah will destroy the world, sending those whose deeds in life are on balance good to paradise, and those who are evil to hell. Until the Judgment Day, the dead will remain in their graves, having only a slight inkling of their future fate. The only exceptions are those who die in the defense of Islam, the martyrs, who will go immediately to paradise, and those who are enemies of Islam will go immediately to hell. This set of beliefs, unfortunately, appears to have spawned a minority of believers in a fundamentalist form of Islam who seek to put this teaching into literal practice. The concept of hell and eternal punishment have long presented a challenge, especially to Christianity. There has always been the dichotomy between the judgmental God of the Hebrew Scriptures, the sometimes jealous, petulant, and vengeful Yahweh, and the beloved Father of the Christian Bible. The God of love in the Gospels, often in the person of Jesus, is contrasted with the wrathful God of judgment of Revelations and the last day. I still have my folders with you. So how does one reconcile the God of love who sent his only beloved Son to die for our sins with the God of wrath portrayed by the 18th century revivalist preacher Jonathan Edwards in his famous portrayal of sinners dangling over the fiery pit? How does one reconcile the gentle Jesus of the Beatitudes with the strict Calvinist doctrine of predestination, where only a select few are destined for eternal bliss while the vast majority of humankind is consigned to eternal and everlasting torment? How does one reconcile a God who loves the whole world with a God who would consign whole peoples to hell for not accepting the correct form of religion? This is the challenge that was faced by the early Universalists. Those preachers and thinkers such as George de Benneville, John Murray, Hosea Ballou, and others preached a gospel of universal love. Operating from the Christian perspective, it was their message that through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God would reconcile all of humanity, not just the select few of Calvinist doctrine. All would be saved in the end. Now, this was obviously heresy to Orthodox Calvinists, but it was a message that resonated with some at this point in history, so that universalism became one of the larger and more dynamic denominations, especially on the frontier. It is said that in Wisconsin, at the time of statehood, the Universalists were the 6th largest denomination. There are some contemporary stories of Universalism as well. The first of these involves the Reverend Carlton Pearson, a black Pentecostal bishop in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 1996, while reflecting on the Rwandan massacre, Pearson was troubled by the notion that all of the people being killed, not being Christian, would, according to the doctrine he believed and was preaching, be consigned to hell. He couldn't make sense of this. In a moment of inspiration, he found himself developing a classical Universalist belief, namely that a just and loving God would not consign all these people to hell. Writing in the UU World in 2009, author Kimberly French described Pearson's experience as follows. Everything Pearson thought he knew was true started unraveling as he began to realize that the whole world is already saved, whether they know it or not. Not just professed Christians in good standing, but Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, gay people. There is no hell after you die, and he didn't have the good sense to keep it to himself. For his trouble, he was convicted of heresy and expelled from his church for preaching what he called a gospel of inclusion. And so ultimately Pearson and 200 of his followers found a home with the Tulsa Unitarian Universalist congregation. For what Pearson was preaching was good old-fashioned Universalism, a doctrine very similar to that of Murray and Ballou 2 centuries earlier. The more recent uptick in the discussion of heaven, hell, and who goes where arose as a result of Rob Bell's provocative book, Love Wins. In this book, Bell, a popular and charismatic Christian evangelical, also challenges the evangelical orthodoxy about the destination of those who don't believe in the correct Christian doctrine as preached in most evangelical churches. Like the early Universalists, Bell preaches that it is unbiblical to envision a God who would consign billions of human beings to eternal and everlasting punishment because they did not believe the correct things. But Bell goes beyond challenging the existence of a place called hell. He contends that heaven is found here in human history. Our job as humans is not to live in a way that it will allow us to go to some better place when we die. Rather, for Bell, taking heaven seriously then means taking suffering seriously now. Bell envisions our responsibility to make the world we live in today to resemble the heaven that we would envision in the future. Bell argues that, quote, what you believe about the future shapes, informs, and determines how you will live now. For Bell, a proper view of heaven leads to full engagement with the world, not simply waiting to go to a different place in the future. Bell's rendition of the gospel message was received with about as much warmth as the preaching of Ballou and Murray in traditional Calvinist circles in the 19th century. He was also accused of the heresy of universalism and of promoting evil. Thus, even in our modern, supposedly secular world, these ancient disputes have some life left to them. So, what does it mean for those of us Unitarian Universalists, it may not be all of us, who really don't believe in a literal heaven or hell or afterlife? What is our response to the question of what's next? Well, for me, Wilder says it very well when he says that it ain't houses and it ain't names and it ain't earth and it ain't even the stars. What is eternal has to do with human beings. There's something deep down inside that's eternal about every human being. At one time during his life, my dad was a coach and a teacher. And at one point there was a group of young men who he started coaching at basketball when they were in 6th grade. And he coached them until they went to high school. Now this is a particularly talented group of athletes who as high school seniors actually went to the state tournament. They didn't win the tournament because before it started, their star shooter and player broke his hand and wasn't able to play. But 50 years later, when my dad died, on the night of his visitation, the first person in line was that man. Now, they'd lived in this same small town, and no doubt had had some contact with one another. But they hadn't spent a lot of time together, had not been close friends. And yet, this man was important for him to be at this, to honor and give his respects to his old coach. And that evening, throughout the night, a number of men came up to me from the community to tell me that my dad had been their coach and had been an influence on their lives. And because he had an influence on their lives, he had an influence on their children and their grandchildren. Now, I don't know if my dad is in a place called heaven. If there is such a place, he certainly deserves to be there. But what he had in his life was an impact on human beings, just like all of us do on one another. We hear that every Sunday when we have and talk about the joys and concerns. So, how do we deal with death if we don't believe in an afterlife? Well, there's a few things. First of all, we recognize that death is a part of life, that it's part of the cycle that we go through. It's not a punishment for something called original sins. Secondly, life's going to go on. Even if we're gone, life will continue. And the love that we have and we've had with us will continue. Meaning of life is the satisfaction and struggle and triumph of living. And finally, we are immortal in the sense that who we are and what we do lives on after we die, Murray observes. We're all part of a chain, stretching back to when life emerged from the primordial soup, and stretching forward when the earth is consumed in a cosmic fireball. Excuse me. So thus, in the final analysis, what's next may very well be the wrong question. While all religious and non-religious traditions attempt to answer this question, the responses are really nothing more than speculation. Perhaps the better question is, what's now? What can we do at this time and in this place to make our lives count? What can we do to make this world a little better for those who are here now and those who will come? So for the next few minutes, we're going to have some music. And while that music is being played, I invite you to think of those who've been important to you, who have gone before you, particularly those who have gone this past year. And as you're willing and comfortable, to simply speak their names as part of the gathered community.